Hello, everyone. Again, I would like to thank Theo Herbst for the wonderful invitation to provide you with this principal keynote of this year's Boat Electrons Festival. I've given it a bit of a funny title, but I think the reason for that is going to become pretty clear as it goes on, and that is making technology-driven, sound-based music relevant. This keynote is not going to be your typical scholarly conference talk, but instead, I hope that you will find that it will serve as food for thought for you, given the ideas I put forward, so that you maybe agree largely with what I'm about to share or disagree enormously. But if that's the case, I sincerely hope that you have a strong view about it. I like to offer keynotes that correspond to the host's theme or an event's goal. And therefore, I asked Theo for a description of what he wanted this year's Boat Electrons to be about. And that led to this talk's abstract, which you may have seen online, but I'm just going to read in full. There's no PowerPoint here, and because of the asynchronous delivery, I'm not even going to include compositional examples, although if the schedule does not change, this keynote was preceded by a concert of members of the MTI Squared Institute, the last of which was mine. So you've got a taste of one example. And I will be talking about my own work, obviously, later on in this talk. So here's your abstract. When inviting me to offer this principal keynote at Boat Electrons 22, Theo Herbst wrote that he sought, and I quote, a keynote exploring creative trajectories around a technology creativity composition core would fit well, particularly thinking through technology's potentially gentle, agnostic, but aesthetically and culturally sensitive responses to how raging post everything debates limit space for sound to be heard. There is a lot of vitriol about. I'm all for providing a gentle, intelligent, sound-based composition response refuge. This wonderful and challenging request, that's end quote. This wonderful and challenging request has led me to my reviewing issues related to sonic creativity. These include which word or words should be capitalized in the field of music technology. The polarity between art for art's sake and art for life's sake. To what extent is a focus on the cultural a norm in sound-based music? Through a discussion of my personal practice involving sampling any sound, these issues are evaluated, leading towards a proposed recipe for making technology-driven, sound-based music relevant in today's society. So I was really thrilled when Theo sent that quotation that I placed in the abstract. It's really loaded with thought and trying to privilege sound and thus music in a technologically driven society, regardless of where we are. I also would like to celebrate the fact that there's a new institute being evolved at the SACM at the University of Cape Town. And so I want to send a special message of congratulations and the hope for fantastic developments at the Plaatjes Institute for African Musics and Technologies. The fact that the word African is included in the name of the Institute, I think, is poignant because it doesn't state where the Institute is, because that's obvious. But it's African music. And I hope that's exactly what takes place at the Institute. As I mentioned in the talk about the Institute, we're in the process of formalizing a collaboration with the college, with the university, and therefore by implication with the Institute, with our Institute. And I look forward to developments that are of mutual development, because the fact that you have put the name African in the name of the Institute is something that most people in Europe wouldn't consider, even though it's probably an essential ingredient, in my view. Nonetheless, many people in the Northern Hemisphere, or particularly in the Americas and in Europe, will often answer the question, how much do you consider your own culture? That's all. And I'm going to try to reverse the trend partially through this keynote. I should state at this point that I've, throughout my life, had an enormous interest in African music. Part of my postgraduate studies were in ethnomusicology. I already had a great interest in world music, otherwise I wouldn't have considered studying it. And my area of focus, although I did not complete a PhD in ethnomusicology, it was in composition, was the Gold Coast of Africa. And therefore, it may come as no surprise that I did spend some time taking drumming lessons from master musicians from both Ghana and Guinea, had a well-developed interest in Nigerian music as well. But in fact, the entire south of Sahara region was of great interest to me because of the diversity of music across Black Africa. And Southern Africa was one of the key areas. And again, it probably comes as no surprise that at one point I equally, for a lengthier period in this case, took mbira lessons from a Zimbabwean musician who lived at the time, like I did, in Amsterdam. And if you did hear my piece, the celebration of its finale is the most powerful celebration of Southern African music. And I could not have ended that piece in any other way. Another thing I want to share about me before I progress into this, which I implied in the talk about the MTI Squared Institute, is that one of my foci as a musician, as a scholar, and as an educator has been to make experimental forms of music relevant in today's world. In fact, the first book that I published was today's experiment. Why so much of it was marginalized, but I also investigated who the culprits were. One of them was that this music was largely, if not totally, not available for young people, ignored on the communications media. But last but not least, the musicians themselves did not spend enough time making it of interest to people outside of the specialist community. And that is going to play a major role in this talk, this interest that I have been pursuing since a student. And why did that happen? Well, at the university where I did most of my studies, which was in New York City, there was a large percentage of people making atonal post-serial music. So there was, in a sense, a school of music at my university. And I noticed at concerts of music from that university, Columbia University in New York, that the vast majority of the public consisted of staff and students from the department, instrumentalists making this kind of music, and the occasional other of the partnership, girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, wife, whatever, friend, who sometimes begrudgingly attended the event, not making the, let's say, the economics of this kind of music make any sense, because the amount of time that it took to create a piece of contemporary music, hopefully, if instruments were involved, get enough rehearsals to make it sound right, and the fact that often the first performance of a work was equally the last one, because there weren't that many performance opportunities and there were a lot of pieces of music being generated, that the amount of input that went into it was not equaled by the output, namely the reception of a finite number of people, often well under 100, and equal, almost as often, well under 40. I'm not saying that a public of 30 is a bad thing. There could be 30 people that absolutely adore what's going on. But it did reflect, in a city of over 8 million people, a marginalized art form. And I thought that raised a lot of questions that I would subsequently address during my entire career. So, this conversation, but the one in particular that I want to focus on is whether the cultural is a norm in sound-based music. So better deal with that term, sound-based music, because a lot of you possibly don't know it or don't use it. The idea, and this is a term I created myself in a book published in 2007, The Art of Sound Organization, is that the music is made with any sounds, not necessarily things called notes. So if the cultural is not a norm in sound-based music, why is that the case? Is it possible to have the cultural play a role in sound-based music? Is it potentially relevant? Is it even urgent, given the fact that the vast majority of sound-based music, electroacoustic music and the like, does not really focus on the musician or the musician's own culture? Clearly, many people do not think it's relevant or urgent. I want to put that in question. So this talk is about making musical connections at the same time as creating one's own individual voice. In other words, music doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are contexts within which your music fits. But there are hopefully equally aspects of your music that is your own, whether it's you singular or you plural. And that identification of connections and individual voice has to do with the sound and the content of the music, as well as extra musical aspects, which can be, as said, cultural. So we're going to come back to this in this talk again and again. Another theme, which I mentioned in the Institute talk, is this idea of where is there a capital, or where are there capital letters in the words music technology, which is, of course, the field in which this festival takes place. Is it music technology, capital T? Is it music technology, capital M? Or is it perhaps music technology with two capital letters? I, for one, have never, will never, and am not interested in music technology. A, because I'm not a technologist, I'm a musician and a scholar, a humanities scholar, a musicologist. And B, because I think the development of technology without an evident musical application could, by serendipity, be very important, but often, and some of you may have encountered that in your own musical experience, lead to dire musical results, but technological potential. I'm not at technological development. A lot of it could not be made without specific technological developments, but in many cases, I myself do not develop that technology. Music technology is what I do and what I study. Again, because I don't have that many strings to my bow, as the expression goes. I'm not as strong a technologist as I am a musician, even though I have an undergraduate degree in computing. But there are music technologists about, people who develop their own technology for their own musical goals. An example in the United Kingdom, somebody of whom you may have heard, is Trevor Wishart, who has developed his own software to enable him to play with sounds the way he wants to in his compositions. And these algorithms, or whatever it may be, these software solutions are not readily available. So he's developed his own tools for composition, which he subsequently shares with others. Or we could take my dear friend John Richards, who is featuring again in Bodo Electronics, who develops his own instruments for musical performance within the do-it-yourself or do-it-together culture. And therefore, with his notion of instrument as composition, is making music of his technology, and therefore I would speak, in his case, again, of a capital M and a capital T. And I find that very laudable, because he is investigating the music through his technology and coming up with musical solutions that is dependent on his technology. And I, again, find that extremely laudable. So to summarize this point, I believe in capital M and a capital M and a capital T. But the capital T on its own, I think in those cases, those developing the technology should be considering the ideal musical application or applications when relevant. Now, my guess would be that the public at Bodo Electrons is mainly musicians. And therefore, there are a few people listening to this talk who have a capital T and no capital M. But if you're there, I hope you agree with my idea that you consider your applications or use musicians as a testing ground before you go public with your technologies. Stating all of this in another manner, I have more than once in my career tried to place the notion of art for art's sake against art for life's sake. Art for life's sake is something I made up myself. I once even gave a keynote where I said art for goodness sake, because I have an issue with art for art's sake. The term art for art's sake, if you're acquainted with it, was actually developed early in the 19th century, and this is not going to be a history lesson. But as we got towards the latter half of the 20th century, with philosophers such as Theodor Adorno, art for art's sake became perhaps a metaphor for art of the intellect, where the experience of art was more to do with your understanding of the art than, let's say, an aesthetic or emotional response. Or perhaps art for art's sake, the aesthetic is the understanding and not the immediate communicative element. Art for life's sake takes into account that we've had enormous developments throughout the arts, the sciences, and technologies in the 20th century, continuing in this century, where it would be ignorant to suggest that understanding is unimportant in art. But I do believe that the emotional communicative experience of art is at least as important as that understanding, that theoretical relationship one forms with art. Now, many people in my field do make art for art's sake. Many of their pieces are abstract, and often there are titles that may be evocative of something but can't actually be heard in the piece, or alternatively, they equally have an abstract title. And the idea is music is an abstract art. Sound-based music can also be an abstract art, and it doesn't matter what it does or doesn't communicate. Art for art's sake is one of the key reasons, in my opinion, and this may be a controversial remark to some, that contemporary art music in the 20th century became largely marginalized. Where there was a big crowd throwing tomatoes at performance of Stravinsky in the beginning of the 20th century, there were virtually no crowds for most contemporary music by the end of it. And given the huge number of people making the music, maybe that goal of becoming the immortal artist became a lot less relevant by the end of the 20th century and the time we're in now than just the great buzz one can get by making a piece that's appreciated by others, or a piece that's made collectively, collaboratively with others. We'll be talking about that. So I have presented art for life's sake as an opposition to art for art's sake, which would allow for cultural content to be made clear in sound-based music, or other aspects that are shared, maybe not explicitly and in detail, but more generally with the public. And that's something that I try to do in the vast majority of my compositions. Now, I want to bring up a couple of things before I move on to my own personal theme that are going to contribute to the mix when we finally get to this so-called recipe at the end of this talk. The first of the two issues of importance that I want to share with you is, where does sound-based music fit within the greater scheme of music today? When I studied ethnomusicology, one of the first things I was asked to learn was that there were three great clusters of music at the time, at least as seen in the developed world. The first and the oldest was folk music, music of the people that was passed on through generations, usually through the ear and through the skills from master to student, or just from people in a village to other people in a village. And of course, there was assimilation that crossed borders and acculturation that crossed national or cultural borders that kept this music dynamic. As the media had an effect, and as many artists became artisans, their own fame and success and their commercial well-being form part of the musical career experience. And with that, we had people in art, or classical music, as it's sometimes called, who became famous composers, famous performers, and so on and so forth. But the real revolution took place when we had reproducible art through the communications media like radio and television, and now the internet, and of course the record, the cassette, the CD, and all the rest. And through that, commercial popular music evolved and now plays the greatest role in music virtually everywhere on the planet. Again, I was really interested in traditional forms of African music as a student, still am today. And it was during my learning years that highlife music became very well known in Nigeria with people the likes of Fela Kuti. And what took place there, as you know better than I, is that pop music instruments were added to, if not replaced, the traditional instruments of society, and amplification was used so that the elements of the successful models of commercial pop music took over, and technology was there to amplify it so you could have a greater audience, and you recorded it, and you had greater success through the reproducible media. I'm not getting at Fela Kuti. I'm a big fan of his and many others. But the point is, it fit into the mold of that popular music category, although it showed its cultural roots much more strongly, as do many forms of popular African music and Pan-African music throughout the diasporas. So it's not me having a go at the lot of pop music. And I'm not even going to have a go at art music, which slowly but surely is turning itself into a museum piece and may make itself totally irrelevant if, in particular, the contemporary forms don't find a way of connecting with society. That which I really want to say is that sound-based music in its diversity, whether it's music of a fixed medium that's pre-recorded and can be spatialized in performance, or mixed music that involves a live performance as well, eventually as pre-recorded sounds, or networked music, noise music, sound installations, and so on and so forth. There are just so many options here. The point is, where does this music actually fit? Well, in my view, the answer is where the roots of the music are and where the musicians want the music to be heard, whether it is leaning more towards a popular culture frame. There isn't that much sound-based music that is purely pop, but there are innovative popular musicians who have certainly used a lot of sounds, as you probably know. And a lot of people that come into this come from an art music tradition, and perhaps for them, frankly, especially those interested in art for art's sake, might want to remain there. But I believe that a great deal of sound-based music fits into an area of its own. Maybe not solely, but perhaps primarily. Music. And given my income from my show, I'm more interested in the innovation involved in it and the communication involved with the public, face-to-face or through dissemination, than I am in commercial success. But of course, I have the advantage of being an educator, and I earn my bread through that. In that book from 2007 that I mentioned, The Art of Sound Organization, I suggested that sound-based music has its own time. That is to say, a body of knowledge, the production, the theory or the understanding, and appreciation of music that exists of itself, just the same way that note-based music has its own paradigm. And although there may be an overlap, there's a lot that is specifically sound-based, and there's a huge amount that's particularly note-based, and that can be subdivided over all the genres and categories throughout the ages and throughout the cultural regions. So I'm suggesting here that we don't have to situate ourselves solely within the traditions. Another point I want to raise is about our awareness of our audiences. I've spoken of marginalized music already and in the other talk. And an interest that I have and have developed over the years is what I call, although the term is not mine, of communities of practice and communities of interest. Communities of practice are those that make the same or similar types of music or use the same or similar types of tools or instruments or interfaces. And the communities of interest are people that like particular sorts or approaches to music, and they form a community. So in modern speak, there are tags that identify these communities of practice or production and communities of interests or appreciation. And I think that if we're aware of our communities of practice in terms of with whom we could work or with whom we find out about developments in our areas, and the communities of interest with whom we share our music, so not anonymously, but targeting those communities of interest, we can broaden both with time. And so that's something that I would like people to consider if they're not doing that already. For whom are you making your music? When I was taught composition, nobody ever asked me why I was making a piece or for whom I was making a piece. They asked me, what is your piece about and how do you make it? And actually, I think the reception is at least as important as construction. That's something that I'd like to share with you today. So I now move on to things that are closer to me and what I do, my personal theme. And as a composer, for many years, although in the initial years I didn't use the term itself, my interest has been the ability to sample with any sounds. They could be a recording out my door, or a recording of sounds from the media, or even recordings of musical sounds. And along with this, my personal interest has been how these samples, when composed together and performed, whether there's a performative aspect to this product, relates to life and thus culture. Because I'm interested in an intention reception loop. I'm interested in my music communicating with an audience. I may have very specific things that I want to communicate, which may have a cultural or political nature. I may have a very general idea about one's relationship with water. If we look at Africa, and we use the word water, as I was told by a colleague at UNESCO, you have very wet regions, particularly along the equator, and you have very dry regions as you get into the Sahel, for example. So water in the Sahel is something that's scarce and precious. And water near the equator, and by the way, in Great Britain as well, is abundant most of the time, and a pain in the butt because you're always getting wet when you go outside. So we all have a relationship with water, but it may be very different. And if I'm doing something with water, it is there to communicate something that has to do with our relationship with that material. So that's art for life's sake, I would suggest. Now, one thing I want to share about this subject of sampling is that I have a view that when you use samples that are potentially meaningful within a culture, you need to treat them with respect unless you are consciously making a political commentary about samples. So if we take a look at recent political history, and the fact that I'm an expat from the United States, passport is media. I'm a sound-based piece, let's say a radio piece, and I'll talk about them in a moment. And I happen to have a recording of the voice of Donald Trump or about Donald Trump. I may not necessarily use that sample with respect, as I had very little respect and still do not have much respect for the man himself. But if I were, for example, to have a sample of music that's meaningful in part of South Africa, whether it was a religious meaning or something to do with ritual or just something that may be very personal to a group in South Africa, I would not just grab it and use it when it's meaningful to those people and not for the rest of the public, because it could touch them in a way that angers them or saddens them, and it's not my goal to do that. So I think one issue when one's talking about samples, since a lot of people use samples in their work, is to consider this notion of respect. And I also want to add that there are legality issues, because when I grab samples from broadcast media or music, the use of them in my work is not unlikely to be illegal. That's because the legislation about samples is quite antiquated. And again, here, I think we should be careful and minimize the risk when we're doing these things with samples. Anybody who knows the history of hip hop knows that there have been loads of lawsuits, litigation, and the like. And I just say, be careful and avoid risk. Now, as I mentioned in the other talk, this idea of reaching out that I'm so interested in is very relevant to sampling because anybody can make it. And as previously mentioned, John Richards and I believe that sampling and DIY music can become a form of 21st century folk music, in that any community can make this stuff together and have a collaborative experience. In the case of sampling, we have the opportunity for collaboration to be sequential. That is to say, somebody does something and puts together a bunch of samples. Somebody else grabs those samples or the piece and remixes them, and so on and so forth, so that the samples and the piece have a life. I find that highly intriguing. So it's not a story that's all about me and my samples and my piece, but it's a story about having fun with samples and hopefully making things that people find of interest, of enjoyment, and of potential reuse. So that's an interesting aspect of sampling that I'd like to share. And let me spend a few minutes talking about my approach to my music. I'm not going to spend that much time. Because I'm interested in art for life's sake, I often coin a word taken from the drama world, namely dramaturgy, which plays a role in drama productions and often in dance productions, but rarely in music productions unless they happen to be opera or the like, which is to do with the intention of the team making a performance in terms of the communicative content. You could summarize that by what is the why of a production? What is the why of a performance or of a piece? And because I have worked in Eastern European cultures when they were still under the auspices of Marxism, I learned that dramaturgy can also be the political dramaturgy of a piece. And I'd had to sell my work to the government officials to make sure they understood it within their context. So that's another form of dramaturgy. And today, because of all of these experiences, I consider this dramaturgy, the why of a work, to be an essential element. And because I consider and that the appreciation be about the surprise, it could be about the humor, because I employ humor in pieces where most people don't, or other aspects that are shared with the listener. And they can privatize the experience because of their experiences with the material that I'm using. Now, because I'm somebody who really would like my works to be intimate, they're best heard live. Whether it's a recording that's spatialized and you get the full whammy of the choreography of sound within the theatricality of the musical experience, or that there is performance, which is very difficult to reproduce on a flat medium with at best stereo quality. If I performed with other channels, I couldn't instantly create a binaural recording for you as a viewer and a listener. So hopefully one day, and Theo and I have discussed this and share the hope that I can be there in Cape Town and share my music face-to-face and in situ with you. So that's why I'm not providing an online performance. And I guess you can see that it's not my goal to be an immortal composer or a celebrity. Otherwise, you'd know my music already, and I assume that few of you do. I've emphasized the collaborative in this talk and the previous one as a kind of antidote for the I me artists in the I me era of it's all about me and my piece. I don't think that's the ideal form of communication most of the time. And I think things that can include the cultural are of relevance. So let me spend a minute talking about the piece that was in the concert and a series of pieces that I've made called the Radio Series. I hope that you were able to see the program note of E Pluribus Plures. By the way, E Pluribus Unum is the motto of the United States, the country of my birth. Out of many, there is one. So it is their hope and their belief that there is one American society from the many inputs into it. But you and I are all aware that in many countries, sadly, including my own and your own, there are dissonances within various communities within the public, which is very sad. And government should do their utmost to unify them. And it's my belief that one of the ways of unifying the various groups within a culture, whether it's lifestyle, color, your skin, your religion, your interests, or whatever, is that we respect all of those things and we celebrate them because they are different and they do have roots and they do have cultural elements that may not be the same as yours or mine. And that we can benefit from finding out what is wonderful about each and every one of them, regardless of the type that I'm referring to. So in that piece of music, I have chosen music from the whole world that I adore for various reasons, and have taken the ritual content into account, which started with various forms of Buddhist music from Tibet and Japan and the rest of China in particular, but just scattered out around the globe, including recordings from Scandinavia, South America, other places in Europe, and loads of recordings from Africa because of that rich diversity. And also because of your interest in rhythm, whereas other countries may be interested in the evolution of a sound and time like Japan, or parallel voices such as can be found in the northern diaspora of the African continent, and so on and so forth. And I celebrate these differences, or the rich harmonies of the country called Georgia. And I believe that they all deserve respect, and they all are unique. And because of the commercial culture, many are at risk of disappearance. And so there is a political message in my piece. Why don't you protect these music? And just like we're trying to protect the earth as it's getting hotter and animals are disappearing, as our flora. So there is a political message to my piece, but it's hopefully enjoyable just as it is, and sounds best when you hear it spatialized in a concert hall. The radio series is very culturally based, and that's why I want to spend a minute on that. The radio series takes on the radio landscape, or soundscape actually, of one nation, and I've made 7 of them. The only exception is that there is an Irish piece called On the Air, EIRE, which is Ireland and Irish language, where you've got Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, which is a country on its own. Some people wanting to unite the country, some people in the north wanting to be totally and fully part of the UK, and the dissonances that provides. But the other ones are about the cultural diversity in a variety of countries. One was made collaboratively with students at a conservatoire in northeastern China, where I have a very, very, very basic knowledge of the language. Others I've had assistance because I don't know the languages well enough, and others I've simply done on my own. I get about 20, 30, 35 hours of broadcasts that are quite diverse from different radio stations from a country. I listen to them, I choose samples, I write down what they say and translate them if I need to, and then I categorize them, and then I remix them into 8-channel pieces in surround sound, which are about the universals of radio, such as time calls early in the morning, where relevant advertisements, station logos, and so on and so forth, news broadcasts, and things that are completely unique in countries. So in Beijing, you have the storytellers that speak so fast you can't believe they're able to talk that fast. Or in the Czech Republic, in Europe, you have the buy and sell show that are extremely regional or within one town itself. where people are selling used pillows or wanting an old motorbike of a certain type, something I'd never heard of before, that was as comical as it was valuable within the culture itself. So here I'm sharing cultural objects that may not be universal and be very special. And therefore the understanding of the piece, like an animation movie for kids, is of different levels. The lowest level would be you don't have a translation, which I don't do if it's not in English. About those political things, but it's very interesting because that culture is so different. Up to, I know the voices, I know the politicians, I know that broadcast, and I remember that, where you get very personal experiences. So multi-level appreciation of something that's got a lot to do with culture. And so I am interested in culture in loads of my works. And I hope that these examples exemplify how they can be incorporated into a work that can be listened to in terms of the contextual listening, that is about the materials used and how they're combined, and the musical listening to pitch, timbre, structure, counterpoint, etc., etc. Why not be able to bounce from one to the other when you're listening to a work that's sound-based? Again, I want to underline my interest in collaboration as a way forward, which has been against at least the Western way of teaching music. A performer is a performer, a composer is a composer. If they're studying jazz, there's collaboration. But the idea of a composer collaborating with a performer to make a piece that is solely of that performer, I was never taught. And it's just an area that would be a good subject for another talk on another day. So let's finally move to my proposal, which is a recipe for making technology-driven sound-based music relevant in today's societies. The first point: think carefully before opting for the capital T on its own in music technology. Think of your potential musicians and listeners. Point 2, similarly, think of your potential audiences before opting for art for art's sake. Again, think of your potential listeners. If you're only interested in making a work for a specialist or expert public, go right ahead. But where it's not obvious, do not expect inexperienced listeners to find their way into a piece unless you offer them things to hold on to, musically and extra musically. Point 3, think of what you'd like to communicate in your music. It doesn't need to be that specific. That is, what would you like your listeners to experience or to receive in your music? How do you spur on that understanding and that emotional response? Through what means? And might these have to do with the content itself or cultural shared aspects of a community of interest or a community of practice? Point 4, in so doing, think about how you are reflecting your own and others' cultures. It doesn't have to be in your face. It can be as subtle as you like. But if culture is of interest to you, and like me, you're able and willing to work with other cultures as a means of communicating that culture, using parts of you and your individual voice and parts of you that are your individual culture and somehow molding them, that's perfectly fine. But how do you communicate that to your audience? And that's something I think we should consider reflecting upon. And I would suggest that those who have not been brought up with the notion of African music or British music, or I'm in the northwest of England, so northwest of England music, or Manchester, or Liverpool, for that extent, reflecting those things. So therefore, point 5, always take into consideration who are involved in your communities of practice and your community or communities of interest. Now, this term comes from a gentleman called Wenger, and I should have mentioned that before, as he was the one that came up with the communities of practice. Being aware of your communities of practice and of interest help inform how you communicate through your music. Making music for anyone makes that communication more difficult unless it's obvious. And if it's going to be unobvious, then maybe that reception is equally going to be unobvious, which brings us in the vicious circle of the marginalization of a lot of contemporary music. Much music is not for everyone, to be honest, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Making music for various communities of interest can be just as well, and therefore the appreciation an intention reception loop is therefore something that you can actually achieve. Finally, because I brought this up a number of times, what role can collaboration play in terms of the making of your music and the taking or reception of it? Collaboration can also have to do with musical communication. And this making and taking collaborative notion is directly related to the previous point where you're focusing on your communities of practice and communities of interest. So the idea of collaboration, assisting the making and the sharing of music is something that forms part of the recipe. And that is the final point. In sum, I am not against art for art's sake. I'm not against music as an abstract art. But music diversified hugely in the 20th century in terms of languages and vocabularies. It equally developed hugely in terms of potential musical material. And finally, there was a revolution in technology as well. One could say there's too much choice. Or one can be more positive about it and suggest that music is about communication and that we should take communication into account, and culture forms part of that communication. In short, I believe that we should consciously consider how to make our technology-driven sound-based music relevant to our communities of practice and our communities of interest, and to people at large today and tomorrow. If you agree with any of the above, then it will have been worth my time sharing this keynote with you. I hope that this forms yet another step in forging links with the University of Cape Town. I again thank Theo for the invitation to provide this talk. And I hope that there'll be a Q&A at the end. Otherwise, I hope that my email address is put up, and please feel free to contact me at any time, whenever you like. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to the rest of the conference as well, and festival.
Leigh, thank you once again for a beautiful, beautiful, stimulating presentation. It is much appreciated. You saw in the chat that I directed an invitation to viewers to submit questions or to participate in perhaps in a different way. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to launch, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to launch just a little bit of a probing. I'd say being a keynote, one perhaps is forced to speak in rather general terms and use larger, collective terms such as cultural and cultural influence, etc., etc. However, do you think we could perhaps spend a bit of time looking a bit closer at examples and approaches to, shall we say, intercultural music making and composition in your own work? Is that something that comes naturally? Is it something, do you sit down and study a culture or a musical style and then find inspiration like that? Or how does it work?
Oh, that's a challenging question, Theo. I don't know whether I have a quick and ready answer to it. Again, to the people listening, apologies for those gaps. They were discovered yesterday, and I do hope some saw in the comments that they were filled. I think in terms of my personal approach to this, Theo, I have to return to the remark I made a few times in the talk about respect. Simon Emerson came up with a lovely kind of metaphor for people who hear something. Let's take the example of a culture's own music, or any music, and just loves the sound of it and wants to reuse it. And so he calls that the picture postcard approach to sampling, which I think is a lovely image. But what's implied by what Simon Emerson said is that there's no understanding, or there's not even an attempt to acknowledge the source of what it is. And as a lot of sounds have meaning, ignoring that, I consider to be a very dangerous step. So if I'm going to cross borders, and I am somebody who has lived and worked in 3 different countries, so a bit of a gypsy. You know, when I speak of my culture, what does that mean? So my ability to go interculturally in a work or focus on a single culture, as in recent case with Mexico, a place I visited perhaps a total of 2.5 weeks in my entire life. You know, who am I to project anything on a Mexican culture? It's the appreciation of the knowledge of what I'm dealing with and the respect for the culture that's involved that allows me to do that. So it's not this kind of trivial, there it is. There's the David Byrne, Brian Eno collaboration that some people may have heard, where they took recordings of people and musics and then put a pop wrapper around it 2 or 3 decades ago, and got in trouble because in one case there was a recital of the Quran that got the pop beat around it, and the whoever was holding the copyright for that recording didn't like that terribly much, and when the record was reissued, that track was removed. An example of the legality issues, I don't want to get at them because the record was fantastic, but it does exemplify the kind of ease that we have in a postmodern culture of, oh, you know, there's all these ingredients, you can mix them and make a great dish from it. But if you do that with music, or you do that with sounds that have meaning, you know, there is the meaningful that you're playing around with here. And I consider that one of the most important criteria of be careful in this type of thing. I see no questions either. We're getting slow in the inquisitiveness.
Hang on.
Oh, there they come.
Now. Indeed. Do you want to pick up directly on the questions without me reading them out? Because obviously everybody can see them.
Yeah, well, if it's getting recorded and for the future, I don't know whether the comments are going to show up on the screen. So Meryl has written, much appreciate your thoughts and themes. How do you deal, whoops, that's just gone out of my vision. So let me just scroll it down. With the ethics of intention. What I mean is that perhaps one has a particular intention when creating a piece, but once received, the audience may interpret something else. Do you think program notes need to explain the meaning, or is it better to leave it up to the understanding of the audience? Great question, Meryl. Absolutely wonderful question. I am a great propagandist of program notes. I think the idea of the piece speaking for itself was reflected in my remarks about art for art's sake. This does not mean that there should not be an individual experience. There is inevitably going to be an individual experience. And often things used in works of mine are misinterpreted. That's the wrong word, because that's a personal interpretation. Every personal interpretation is valid, and I did not consider that interpretation when making it, and so I will take all of the blame. So yes, that ethics question is reflected by that word respect. The ethics joins into that discussion, it joins into the legal discussion, and it joins into the understanding of what the sample's source and meaning are. So I do think it's worth explaining the meaning, but I also know, even if I write one, I run the risk of it not being read. Great question. But as I know, you need to move forward with this wonderful festival, and there are two others. Cameron, thank you for the really interesting talk. Do you have any examples of best practice of using collaboration and flattering the pedagogical hierarchy when it comes to teaching, especially undergraduates, in the context we generally need to fit into, which are very grade-based? Another gem of a question. Well, I had the fortune, Cameron, in my previous job to this one, of being head of a contemporary arts department. So it wasn't only music, but we had all of the other arts, in particular dance and drama and performance art. And even when you're doing performance in music, depending on the kind of music you make, the collaborative experience plays a role. So when we have the grading or marking situations, we call it in Britain, and we have group work, and you have the potential inevitable student who doesn't work as hard or doesn't show up, et cetera, we have ways of triangulating the experience of the process of making, which I think any educator should write into the assessment criteria in the educational context, because the engagement in the process and the engagement in the product are equally important, I would suggest. So that's in terms of constructing an element of a module on a course. I have tried to get collaboration into curricula for which I've had any responsibility or participation, simply because I think the I-me model of I am a composer, and thank you, John, for saying you are not a composer, you're a much more holistic artist. The composer is this immortal thing that is a first person singular. The work is this fixed object without flexibility. And I think our cultures have evolved that we need to reevaluate both. And the only way to reevaluate both is to teach people getting engaged in this, whether through workshops or undergraduate courses or whatever, to see the option of the idea of collaborative and, in the extreme case, collective creative practice, sometimes known as devising. And in these cases, the idea of the process and the product need to be investigated very much. Looking at John's work, I would suggest that many of his performances are moments in time of a process. They're not the product of all the work. Clearly, he has CDs with recordings of performances on them. Of course, they are just a document of that moment in time, of that point in the process. And if they're missing the visuals, you're missing a great element of his work. So, as I often cite John Coltrane's My Favorite Things as a very, very famous recording, it was just a gig or a recording studio moment. It's not the piece, because every time he played it, it sounded different. And we need to know the process more than the product, or at least as much as. And so this encyclopedia entry of My Favorite Things by John Coltrane, great performance, but it's just a moment in time. And I think we as artists need to see the importance of process and the collaborative experience as essential elements to get away from the paradigm of the almighty composer and the almighty work. Doesn't fully answer your question, but it points in the direction of the type of things I've done in the community and in education. For Miles, that's the last one I have at the moment. Thanks for the great talk. In South Africa, we have a strange relationship with art music. There are large groups of people who are very much afraid of anything new, even music by those from the so-called Second Viennese School, etc. I've noticed that the more experimental practices here are slowly changing the way people engage with this, particularly among the young and students of music. Do you think is counterintuitive to your idea of art for life? In my mind, it straddles both art for life and art for art. Thanks. Terrific question, and fascinating to see this evolution taking place. Yesterday, when Theo had noticed these glitches in my talks, and the embarrassment with me is beyond words, I congratulated him and what's going on at SACM as his being in an avant-garde, something that I in my lifetime have hardly been able to experience. And as I said to Theo yesterday, when I was a student, John Cage was an old man. So what was I to add to the completely radical things that he'd already added to? So having this discussion about the new in South Africa is a very relevant one. And a few thoughts on the subject. First of all, it is still true in Europe and other developed nations that performers going to conservatoires are told that they should not engage in new experimental music as it will be harmful to their technique and to their voices. I have known within the last 10, 15 years of singers wanting to sing the Sequenza for Voice by Luciano Berio, which is an absolutely formidable piece, being told that they're going to ruin their lungs. So please don't perform this piece. And so we're in the 21st century and it still goes on. So this tension is not only a South African thing, it's not only an African thing, it's a global thing, where either circumstances or in the case of these conservatoires, conservatism have played a big role. I would also suggest, and I think this is very important, and it takes me back to that study of ethnomusicology, there is not such a thing as art music. There are art musics. In Asia, this is sometimes called court music. And I do not have the knowledge that I would like to have about South Africa, but I would consider that there are art musics within this diverse nation. So I'm taking your art music within inverted commas, and thank you for including them, as meaning European art music. And I can well imagine tutors not wanting to deal with the Second Viennese School, which, by the way, is celebrating its 100th anniversary in terms of Schoenberg's first around now. So, oh my gosh, 100-year-old music is too modern for us. No, we have to just see it within the context in which it was made. We can also look at it in terms of the reception and the success or lack thereof in different circumstances, and take it as it is, personalize the experience within the circumstances in which you in South Africa are wanting to kick this object around, or things that happen afterwards, or thing that you come up with yourself. So is it counterintuitive to my art for life? Well, that depends on how abstract the technique or concept that you're dealing with is or might become, I think, and equally to what extent the communicative aspects of whatever it is you would like to indulge in, Miles, is of relevance. And so I think, despite all the gaps in the talk, it was hopefully clear that what I'm trying to suggest is that the emotional communicative in art is optimized with the intellectual understanding. It's not one or the other, just like it's not music or technology, but what we're doing is optimizing. And optimizing given the infinite selection of possibilities you have, whether you're borrowing from the Viennese and the Germans from 100 years ago, or any technique that any artist anywhere on the planet came up with in the meanwhile. I would say go for it. As I've written elsewhere, we have the thesis antithesis, synthesis, triad proposed by a famous philosopher that you may or may not have studied. We should start synthesizing these things in a beneficial manner that hopefully, from my point of view, includes that communicative aspect. But again, it's an individual decision. If you, Miles, or anyone else listening wants to do art for art's sake, wants to engage with fully abstract music that's fully open to individual interpretation, and or do music technology without an apparent musical application, please do so.
Leigh,
Theo, as far as I can see, I don't see any further questions.
just high praise from everybody, which I'd like to channel and reflect again. Thank you so much for making time. And we do look forward very much to receiving you in South Africa as absolutely soon as possible. Thank you, Leigh.
Well, I hope that we can present the music of things at John with the music of sounds in the not too distant future. It would be wonderful, but it's been an honor to be able to share my thoughts with you. And I hope that those who are not running off to lunch at the moment will enjoy the pieces that follow, including the one that I thought had already been played before my talk. Enjoy.